Let's talk about how to listen to podcasts effectively with Notion. But first of all, what podcast do I listen to? Now, podcast should do one or two things. It should educate you or entertain you. If it's not doing any of those, then what's the point? So for me, I'm a finance bro, I'm a gym bro, I'm also into hip hop. I listen to 3 podcasts most of the time. The Macro Hive podcast by Bilal Hafiz, the FT podcast, and also the Joe Budden podcast. The first 2 are financial podcasts, and the last one is more or less for entertainment. Now for the first 2, these are educational podcasts. The Macro Hive podcast is hosted by Bilal Hafiz, who's an ex-MD from Nomura Deutsche Bank in equity research, and each week he brings on different guests to talk about different macro issues currently going on in the world, and it's very insightful. And actually, I remember quite vividly during C20, I would literally go for 1-hour walks while listening to his podcast, and it struck me. I was listening, but I wasn't actually taking anything in. Like, I would understand, remember during that time, but next week, if you asked me, what did I listen to? I could vaguely tell you, and it's because I wasn't listening effectively. This is where Notion comes in, or any note-taking app you have. So how to actually listen to podcasts? If the podcast is educational, you want to be able to remember that information because then it can help you. When I was interviewing for banking roles, I listened to a lot of podcasts, and in particular the Macro Hive podcast, but listening only helps and only works if during the interview you can actually recall that information. If you can't recall it, then what's the point of listening? So that's where Notion comes in. With Notion, you can more or less create a workspace. I've created one called podcast, and also you can create a table, and I've created a table called the Macro Hive podcast. Now, in that table, this is going to sound long, but each episode you listen to, you want to create a separate line. So episode 1 could be should do buy Bitcoin, episode 2 could be how to invest in Bitcoin. When you then click on open, you can more or less then have some notes down based on the interesting facts from the podcast, or even summarize the podcast. It could be that the guest more or less said that Bitcoin would go to 100k based on the following factors, and after listening to the podcast, try and research those factors and see if it makes sense, and then add on your own research underneath that. And also what you can do is create tags next to it, so that way you know what our podcast is about. So now I can put a Bitcoin tag here, and also I could put an equity tag. So that way, when I've listened to like 50 episodes, I can then say, okay, what podcasts have I listened to that talks about Bitcoin or about equities or about Tesla? Do those tags, they're very important. And what you should do is at the end of every week, or even every day if you can, go over those notes and try and see, does this make sense? What else can I add on to this? Has something else updated in the market? And make a note down below. And by doing this process, you start to build a very big knowledge bank that honestly will be more than priceless. Imagine you have 100 episodes listened to, and for each one you have the tags, you note about Bitcoin, equity, and Tesla, you note about cocoa, you note about options, and each month or each week you review all of those notes. I promise you that during an interview, you're gonna freaking ace it. I promise. So now that we've seen how to listen to podcasts quite effectively, what are some good podcast habits? Like, what should you be aware of when listening to a podcast? The first one, and I mean the first and most important one, is you have to understand the biases and the platform you're listening to. The most common example I see is people complain that the Diary of a CEO podcast, that's Steve Bartlett, I believe is his name, he always brings on different guests that contradict each other, which in my mind is the whole point of having a podcast. First of all, Steve is a host and he brings on the experts. Now, each expert would agree and disagree on a number of major things. That's the whole point. You can always find an expert to agree with your point of view. And I actually think it's quite good that it brings on different people that, yes, do contradict each other, but it's not on you, the listener. The main issue lies with the listener. Most listeners now are very lazy. They just want to listen to a podcast and one person tells them, you need to eat this diet, and they just go and eat it and magic happens. But no, some might say the carnivore diet is the best one, some might say it's paleo, some might say it's vegan. Now, it's on you as the individual to get this information and then go and put it into practice. Because most of these experts derive their conclusions from meta research and from studies. And depending on who you sample, those studies could contradict each other. And I actually think it just involves some critical thinking on the listener's parts. And I get it, our generation likes very quick and easy ways to do stuff. But honestly, guys, when you listen to to me or to anyone, literally taking that information and then ask yourself, does this make sense based on my research and based on my understanding? And if it does, so be it. And if it doesn't, that's good. Now go and search for more answers. The next good podcast habit is to have a few you listen to. People always brag that, oh, I have 10 podcasts I listen to. But honestly, why do you need 10 podcasts? To be honest with you, if you have one or two that are very good, that more or less cover everything you need, then stick to those two and try and listen to all the episodes. Me, for example, I'm into finance. They are like probably a million finance podcasts. You can't listen to all of them. Also, I get you think the new one might be better than the old one, but find a podcast or podcasts you really connect with. I think more than 5 is not really ideal, because when do you have the time to listen to all of them? Because a podcast should, like I said before, entertain or educate you. If you have more than 5 educational podcasts, there's no way you have the time, plus your day job, plus other stuff, to actually make notes and remember what they're saying and actually have time to do the active recall. There's literally no time. So find 2 or 3 you really connect with and proceed on those. Also, pick a consistent time you can listen to podcasts. It sounds weird, but for me, I always listen to my podcast on the train to work, on the train back from work, on the drive back from the gym. Those are the only 3 times I would listen to a podcast. It doesn't matter if I'm free. I will not listen to a podcast at any other time, because more or less my mind and body has been primed to accept that information and be ready to make notes at those specific times. Also, I think Ali Abdal talks about this. Listen on more than 1x speed. I get it might sound like you guys are just trying to be overly productive, but why not listen on 1.5x speed? If you can get information in, I'm not saying do 2.5x, but if you can still understand what they're saying, then why not listen to it faster and get through quite a lot in one sitting? Because if you listen on 1x, maybe during a 30-minute training session, you can only get 1 podcast in, but 1.5x or even 2x, you can get 2 podcasts in and learn a lot more. So why not try it and see if it works for you? Now, the last thing for podcast is you cannot listen to a podcast if you're doing any other important stuff. Your brain cannot focus on 2 important tasks at the same time. If you're in work, you're in banking, you're in law, in fact, you're in any corporate job or any job in general, you can't be working and listening to a podcast. You're going to make a mistake in your work, I promise you, because you're trying to listen and understand what the podcast people are saying. Maybe they're joking, they're laughing. In the same breath, you're trying to focus on work, understand what work is doing. It doesn't work. I promise you, it doesn't work. Which is why, again, I'll say find a time that's consistent that you can listen to a podcast and stick to it. Hope you guys have found that video useful. If you have, please drop a comment and leave a like. It definitely goes a long way. And I'll see you in the next video.